Sorry, mate. Let's get started here in just a second.
It's their version.
Yeah, it's over there. Sorry. Thanks for that. I'll just hold on to it. I'll get it. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We went over the syllabus stuff last week. I sent out an email about why we had to stay in the room. Questions about that, issues, problems, things you want to come back to about the syllabus? There's tons of stuff to come back to in Hegel, obviously, I know, but, and we'll be on marching through some of that stuff today. But questions, issues, problems? All right, good. I will have, so the main thing you need to worry about in terms of assignments for this class for this quarter is the exegetical assignment. I'll get that out usually about week 5. So just so you're worried about that, I'll post it on D2L, the assignment for the exegetical assignment. I'll give you, those of you who've been through this, there'll be nothing surprising about it, but there's 3 or 4 passages. I'll ask you to pick one. You'll write an exegetical assignment about that, more about that when I hand that out. But I usually do that about week 5, so you've got plenty of time, week 5 to week 10, really past that, because I don't require you to submit it until, the 25th of November, right? So for now, don't worry about it, is what I recommend. Don't think about it even too much, really, at all. All right. Other questions, issues, problems? All right, so what I'm going to do initially, so I've pulled this up because I wanted to show you in the outline section of the D2L site. I've got the Phenomenology of Spirit preface, they have an outline for that. The preface and the introduction, I put them together because they're short. There's an outline for that as well. I'm going to be using this hermeneutic paradigms in just a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. But if you want to look at where the other outlines are, that's where to find them, that's where they'll be. We'll get back to the details of this later on, but just want to go ahead and have it in place. Yeah, cool. All right, so back to that in just a little bit. All right, so let me start off by way of review. I'm not going to review literally everything I did last time. That would be nuts crazy. I'm going to go back and touch on the highlights just to remind you of certain things. I'm not going to go back into with near the detail I did last time, obviously. I'm just going to highlight some of the things about post-Kantian idealism generally, and then we'll be on to a certain kind of monism, that is the ontological monism of Hölderlin and Schelling and Hegel, and then on into Hegel fairly quickly from there. I do want to get us into the introduction today and get us through the introduction today so that we are dealing with this text called the strange text. We'll talk more about its strangeness next week, obviously, with what must the science begin, right? So we'll talk about that next week. There's a ton of stuff to work in that section as well. And then finally, after that, we'll be into the logic proper. And we'll ask this question, a question we'll ask repeatedly throughout the class. How is this a logic, right? Because it doesn't look like a logic. So we'll talk about that a little bit today. We'll talk about it more as we get approach the actual reading of the logic itself. All right, so let me just remind you, I gave you 4 questions to work with and think about. We'll be thinking about them throughout the rest of the quarter. Let me just remind you of those 4 questions. We've worked on 2 of them a bit already. I'm going to review the answers I tried to give last time with those. And then we're going to use the other 2 today to talk about some other matters more broadly in Hegel, and then we'll be on to the introduction itself. So here are the 4 questions. First is about the problematic, right? The problematic that Hegel's trying to think. So what is the fundamental issue? What is the basic problematic that is at the very core of Hegel's thought? What we might say, Hegel's always striving to think in some form, fashion, or other, at least in his mature philosophy. So roughly 1807 through his death, 1831. Second is about the project, specifically the project of the science of logic. You could ask a different question. What's the project of the phenomenology? What's the project of the encyclopedia, various parts of the encyclopedia? We're asking you specifically about what is the project of the science of logic itself. So that's what we're trying to grapple with there. By that, by project, I mean what is he trying to accomplish? What is he trying to do uniquely in that work? Right? What's that work really about? What's this thing supposed to be? I mean, we're going to be lost in the weeds lots of weeks, right? Lost in the sense of overwhelmed with all the things he's talking about, but also just trying to figure out what's going on. And one thing, I'm not saying it's the only thing, and I'm not saying it's a cure-all, but it's certainly not a cure-all, but one thing that's often helpful is to back out and say, okay, what the hell is this book supposed to be doing in the first place, right? And how does this, whatever the this is, and however confused we are about it, how does that or might that or supposed to contribute to that overall goal? If you'll ask yourself that kind of reorienting question from week to week, I think that'll be really useful and helpful. And you're going to see Hegel, he's already said something about that in the preface. He said very little, but he did say something about it in the preface. We'll see him say more about it in the introduction. That's what he says in the preface he did, right? I talked about this stuff in the introduction, so the material that you read for today. And then you'll, of course, see him talk about this all along the way. And the real project of the science of logic, you really can't see fully until its end, right? Because that's what he says about that. But he's got there's enough clues here to begin to get a sketch of the overall structure of what's going on. Those two questions we dealt with last week, I'm going to come back and review some answers to those that we already have on the table, as mysterious and strange and puzzling as those answers, let me use those in scare quotes for the moment, might seem to be. Here's the other two questions that I introduced last week. We're going to focus on them here in just a moment, and that's this. Here's the third one. This is about critique. So problematic project, critique, sorry, I couldn't do the alliteration. Problematic project, critique, third. So what is the critique or critiques, plural, of Hegel's thought? Not all of them, there's tons of them, right? But what are the critiques that have served to set the agenda through which his subsequent readers, including ourselves, right, have come to his work, right? So what are the basic criticisms of Hegel's thought that have come to shape and mold our approaches to even reading Hegel, right? No matter what level we're reading Hegel, introductory level, sophisticated level, whatever we might be, and all the places in between, and sometimes it's sophisticated, really not that sophisticated. So just because we've read it 1,000 times doesn't mean we've gotten anything out of it any of those times. Let's try to see what the critiques are that are setting the agenda for our reading in a lot of ways. And then finally, fourth, and that's what this will be, what are the hermeneutic paradigms, the basic hermeneutic paradigms, that define the lay of the land in terms of contemporary, at least, interpretations of Hegel's thought. So let's get a sense of what's the lay of the land in terms of understanding Hegel's thought. What are the basic approaches, overall approaches? You're going to see I'm going to favor one over the others, but I want you to be aware when I favor one over the others, that doesn't discount the others. Right? Just because I take one approach doesn't mean the other approaches aren't valid, important, interesting. I read them all. Right? This is not how this works. Right? I'm just telling you, here's the one I think is most textually grounded. But that doesn't mean that it's most philosophically cogent, doesn't mean it's the best one to enlighten what you're doing, so please read widely, I do. Don't dismiss someone just because they fall in a camp, I don't know what that would mean here, but an approach that is not the one that may be shared by me or others or whatever you might think about that. So we'll come to those in just a little bit as well. Now, we'll, as I said last time, be exploring all those questions throughout the rest of this quarter and the next quarter as well, if you hang around for the next quarter. These are questions that we're not going to just solve in the next couple weeks, today, last week, and today, but we're going to be grappling with them in some form, fashion, or another, right? So I would behoove you that, you know, by the end of the last, 20 weeks we're going to spend in the logic, right? You say for the whole thing. That sounds fantastic to me. It may sound like a drudge to you, but I have a sickness called loving to read Hegel, and so 20 weeks sounds fantastic to me to spend on this text. I could spend more, but okay. But at the end of those 20 weeks, we will be grappling with those same four questions, and hopefully, if I do my job half-assed well, we should be having better answers to those questions. Certainly not the ones I'm about to sketch, but we'll have some more informed answers to those questions. So let me come back to the sketches I offered in response to the first two questions, the theses I gave you last week about the problematic and the project, problematic of Hegel's thought and the project, and talk about those briefly again. So I said last week that the problematic of Hegel's thought, in his mature philosophy, what he's always trying to think, if you ask him, what is this all about? He has an answer. Right? He uses this phrase consistently and repeatedly. He says, what I'm always trying to think, what science, philosophical science, right, he's always trying to think, is the necessity of the concept. The necessity of the concept. Now, at this point, that should mean literally nothing. Right? It's a nice turn of phrase, maybe not even that nice. It's a turn of phrase that literally has a modality, necessity, and a subject, a concept. And what is it about? Who the hell knows? He will also say, this is no more helpful, right? I said this last time, that if you ask him what is he trying to think, he's trying to think the idea. the absolute idea. Okay, what does that mean? Concepts, necessity, idea. He's invoking these phrases, but what does he really mean? Those are all obviously hugely contested terms, let's say that. Or if we associate with them our standard conceptions of them, necessity sounds like mechanical causality, maybe. Concept sounds like some sort of generality. That's weird. Ideas sound like things I have in my mind. The absolute one is what does that mean? None of that makes any sense. I told you last week that one way of trying to understand what the necessity of the concept, what the idea means, is to say that it means the logic of generative negative determination. The generative logic of determinate negation. Now, I realize that's replacing one phrase, which is vacuous and meaningless at this point, with one that is perhaps equally, if maybe not more so, vacuous and useless. But let me try to develop that last one a bit, and by doing so, hopefully we can develop what the necessity of the concept means. I did this a little bit last week historically and textually. Let's do a little bit of that, remind ourselves a little bit of what that might mean in just a second. What about the project? So let me get both on the table, then we'll work on both together by reminding ourselves what we did last week. So in the science of logic, Hegel seeks to lay out the fundamentals, I claim, of a genuinely post-critical, that means post-Kantian, metaphysics. Now that already signals where we're going with this question about how do we approach Hegel's thought. Is it a metaphysics or is it not? So already I'm telling you, I think the science of logic is some form of metaphysical enterprise. Right? And we'll talk more about that, of course. But just to link it up with what we've already talked about, what the science of logic does is it lays out, it deduces and elaborates an ontology of determinate negation. An ontology of determinate negation. That is the fundamental, you could call it the formal ontological structure, a set of categories, that's what I mean by structure, so the categories of reality, all of which flow from, they are constituted or produced by, the necessity of the concept, the idea. So again, I think I've just linked two things that are vacuous together by saying that, but at least you can begin to see how things are supposed to go together, even if you don't know what they mean. Right? So I'm quite comfortable that if you don't know what they mean yet, fine. Just keep the terms together long enough, and the content, as we begin to fill them in every week, hopefully, right, will start to work together. Now, last time, to make some sense, only some sense of those, I offered to look at what I call the thought space, the Denk realm, the conceptual realm of what was going on in late 18th, early 19th century German philosophy. That's the historical reference point for Hegel's emergence as a thinker, for Hegel to emerge as Hegel. Hegel wrote a ton of stuff before 1807. Some of it's published, much of it is not. I think he really comes into his own. Hegel becomes Hegel, frankly, in 1807, right, with the publication of the Phenomenology, for reasons we can talk about. And then he really, as I said last time, he publishes 4 books, right? He publishes The Science of Logic, which we're reading. He publishes this encyclopedia. He revises it twice, so there's 3 versions of it. And then there's the finally on that list of the books he wrote, The Philosophy of Right, the outlines of the Philosophy of Right. So those are the 4 books he actually published. And that's him really as himself, right? That's him thinking himself. There's pre-mature writings, right, that he did. They're very valuable. I recommend them highly. But notice what they are and what they aren't and where he's at in terms of his own development, his own maturation. He spent a long time as a Kantian. He spent a long time as a Schellingian, right? Kind of Hölderlinian Schellingian. We'll talk about that again in just a moment. And eventually emerges with the Phenomenology really publicly in his own voice. So I want to go back and talk about those historical reference points just briefly. I don't want to put you through that history lesson again. But the 2 reference points we used were the transcendental turn and the monistic turn in that history, to talk about both the problematic and the project of Hegel's thought. So let me summarize, and I'm doing horrible historical work here when I do this, so let me acknowledge that, but it's I think, accurate enough to make the points that we need to have in place here. So here's what really defines the Denk realm of the thought space of post-Kantian idealism. They all roughly agreed that the aim of Kant's philosophy was the right aim. This is what makes them post-Kantians, right? This is focusing on the Kantian side. What did that mean? It means that the critical philosophy, that's what they call Kant's philosophy because they put it together with Fichte's philosophy, right? So it's a critical philosophy in general. That's what Kant himself called. So the critical philosophy succeeded in creating the most resourceful philosophical system in modern times. A system that was deeply committed to basically three things: the unity of reason, the systematic oneness of all knowledge. You see this all over Kant's work. All the critiques are preparatory in this sense, right? They're leading towards the system of critical metaphysics. He says it repeatedly. You can argue about whether he ever did it or not, where, if he did, where it's at. Welcome to Kant Studies world, right? It's one of the things we argue about there. But he was clearly committed to the unitary nature of reason. Reason is one, he said. Reason is one. What he meant by that is the theoretical capacity of reason, the practical capacity of reason, the aesthetic capacity of reason. All of that is one, right? We're talking about one reason, not disparate capacities, right, that human beings have. It's all one. And the knowledge that flows from those various capacities is also therefore one. So we should be able to put it in a system, as Kant famously said, under a fundamental principle. And for everyone who comes after Kant, that's the definition of what a system is. A system, he says in the first critique, Kant says in the first critique, is the organization of knowledge under a fundamental principle. So everyone else who talked about system building, that's what they meant. Now we're going to see there's variations on that theme, right? But that is what they all understood themselves to be undertaking when they said, we are constructing a system. Kant also held, the critical philosophy also held, not just the unity of reason, its oneness, the oneness of all knowledge, so systematicity, but it also held to the paramount value of autonomy, freedom. Now this gets cashed out in varying ways, and in Kant, I don't want to get lost in all the details of all those debates, but you can, I think, cogently argue in Kant's philosophy that he does clearly think that the oneness of reason, the nature of the oneness of reason, is that reason is at its core self-determinative. Now that has different permutations, right, in the theoretical and in the practical. In the practical, it means we give ourselves the law, the moral law. In the theoretical, it means we give ourselves our experience through the categories. Self-consciousness is the way that happens. So self-consciousness and self-determination would be two least ways of thinking about autonomy in its theoretical and its practical sense. But at the core of both of those is the understanding of human beings, the nature of reason, the nature of rationality is that it's autonomy. It gives itself the law. The law can be practical, the law can be theoretical, but we give ourselves the law. The law comes from us, nothing without. And then finally, and connected to those first two, they believe that Kant gave us a conception of the world that was coherent. Coherent. It made sense of the world. It could explain how things were driven by natural mechanism, but also how we could also believe things that didn't accord with that. How we could hold matters of faith, like God, freedom, and immortality, as we talked about last time, how those things could be true, could be held affirmatively, despite the fact that our senses are full of nothing like that. Right? Uncaused causes like God, things that exist forever, like the soul, its immortality. The world having a purposive structure, a teleological structure. None of that's evident in front of us. Right? Our senses testify against that. But we can, under Kant's view of things, reconcile the naturalistic view of the world that our senses seem to testify to with the beliefs that we have as a matter of moral faith. Moral faith. So that's the cornerstone of Kant's thought, is this notion of rational faith. I had to deny reason, aufhebt reason, in order to make room, knowledge or kenntnis, in order to make room for faith, glauben, belief, to take a less sectarian view of how to translate that particular term. Just, I always like to remind us of this. When Hume was translated into German, by Hamann, by the way, we translated excerpts from Hume, every time that Hume said belief, which Hume says constantly, you can't know that with necessity, but you can, we believe it, we hold it to be the case. Every time the term belief comes up in Hume, almost, Hamann translated it with glauben. We hear faith as a sectarian, religious adherence. Not the case, as they were working with it. Now Hamann took it that way, but they all read Hume as a kind of fideist, right? What you can't know, you can still believe and hold to be the case. Well, here's Kant trying to show how you can hold things to be the case, and that's reconcilable with reason's demand of being able to fully and completely explain things. All right. So everyone thought that's a monumental achievement. Kant's thought, Kant's work, particularly the first critique, second critique, they also were there for the third. They would say that is a monumental achievement. There's no going back behind it. before. We're not trying to get back to somebody else. Now, they will go back to the other figures. They'll go back to Plato, they'll go back to Aristotle, they'll go back to Spinoza, Descartes, whomever. But they all have to pass through the cipher, right, the sift of Kant, or that's one. So when we say that Hegel's doing a post-critical metaphysics, we mean he's doing metaphysics, but not in the way that Plato or Aristotle, Aquinas, whomever else you might favor, was doing it or thought of that particular project to be done. It has to go through critique. So there's the aim, they all agreed to that. Here's the impasse though, and this they all largely agreed to as well. Kant himself, they would say, failed to establish the systematicity of reason. This is what his ambition was, but he failed to actually achieve it. Why? Because his thinking was hopelessly entangled with the dualism. The whole of the Kantian enterprise is rooted on this distinction between objects as they are for us, the phenomenal, and objects as they are in themselves, the noumenal. What we can merely think about, the noumenal, objects as they are in themselves, but we can't know, and objects as they are for us, which we can know empirically. Obviously, you could touch the table in front of you, there's empirical knowledge, but I can also know that that table and every other object that I have as a possible object of experience must conform to the conditions that my subjective capacities lay upon it, namely that it be somewhere, somewhen, space and time, that it be qualitative, quantitative, relational, and modal, otherwise it couldn't exist for me. And I can know that a priori. I can know that, I don't have to wait for experience, I can know that prior to experience, a priori in that sense, logically prior to experience, as a condition of the possibility of experience. But the price to pay, and that's how you can reconcile then what you can know and what you can believe in. Because you can believe in things in the noumenal if you have sufficient warrant to do so. As we talked about last time, the moral law gives you that sufficient warrant. And you can know things empirically, but you can also know things metaphysically. Right? You can know things at the transcendental level. You can know things at the level of the conditions of the possibility of experience. That's what transcendental has come to mean. But if you go down that route, then you're saying, well, the unity of reason, the systematic wholeness of our conception of the world is predicated on something that's broken apart. The phenomenal and noumenal world. Once you tear Humpty Dumpty apart, how do you put them back together again? You can't. And this is, in essence, the problem, right? Everybody after Kant says, unity of reason, we're all on it. We want to build systems, that's what we've got to do. That's what philosophical forms of knowledge really are indebted to do, or required to do. But we can't go down Kant's route simply, because the phenomenal-noumenal divide will never be reconcilable. Kant himself seemed aware of this, as I mentioned in the third critique, and massively in his posthumous writings. And they were all richly aware of it from the very time it got offered to them. So the conclusion for them, so the aim, the impasse, now the conclusion, is that Kant's philosophical enterprise was thus judged to be correct in terms of its basic aim, what it was trying to achieve, unification of reason in the form of a systematic unity of reason. But it was thought by many to have betrayed its own goal by its dualistic methodology. Aim is right, method is problematic. That's the basic judgment. The aim, unification of reason, that's right. They all signed on to that, they all affirm that. What we can't affirm is the dualistic methodology to get there. The phenomenal-noumenal divide is the core of that. There's many divides in Kant, right? But that's the core one they're most often worried about. And by the way, they think that's the reflection of a broader cultural divides that are going on. Kant's is really, for them, just symptomatic of those kinds of divides. Like the divide between subject and object, humans and the world, God and humanity, all those kinds of alienations, as Hegel was to come to call them, are prevalent in the world, and the Kantian dualistic methodology is but one more symptom of a broader cultural issue that has to be addressed. So here's their proposal. Right? So that's what makes them Kantians. Everybody make some sense of that? We talked in more detail about that last time, but that's really all I want to say about it today. I mean, we can say more, but that's the basics I want to play. And here's their proposal. In order to overcome Kant's impasse, to overcome the dualism of the phenomenal-noumenal, then you've got to set the critical philosophy on a new foundation. That foundation has to be monistic, has to be oneness. That oneness takes on different characteristics. We'll remind ourselves of those in just a moment. I count 3, there's probably 15, but let's deal with 3 for the moment. And they're really trying to address this dilemma of how do you have the unification of reason when you predicate it, when you base it on, when you're trying to construct it on a dualistic foundation. You can't. So what do you need to do? Think the foundation differently. Think the foundation differently. So they would say, here's the conclusion they drew from this, you can't go back beyond Kant. You can't just dismiss Kant. It's uncircumventable in that way. You've got to go through Kant. So the transcendental term was therefore necessary. It was correct. It's uncircumventable. But it also needed to be followed by a monistic term. So the transcendental term historically, and they would say conceptually necessitates this transformation that you've got to go through, which is to have a monistic term. A turn away from the dualisms of Kant's thought to a monistic whole, W-H-O-L-E, for only such a foundation as this can truly establish the unity of reason, which they all would say is our aim. Now, so far so good? All right, 3 kinds of monism, then we're on to Hegel, really. Right? 3 kinds of monism because, as I said, there's probably 15, but 3 prominent kinds of monism because that helps us situate what Hegel and others, right, were doing over against what the others in this period are doing. So let's be brief about it. We can talk about epistemic monism. That's really attach names to these things. Early Reinhold and early Fichte. Right? Early Reinhold, early Fichte. That's epistemic monism. We'll talk about what characterizes that in just a moment again. Practical monism. This is really Schiller, Herder calls in this, the early German romantics. I'm thinking particularly of the Schlegel brothers and Novalis. Practical monism. And then finally, the one we're going to focus on, obviously, ontological monism. The central purveyors of that were Hölderlin, Schelling, and Hegel, the classmates, roommates for a time at the Tübingen Stift, the seminary in Tübingen, all preparing to be Lutheran pastors. Not a one of them ever became a Lutheran pastor, by the way, so failed in that regard. They went on to other pursuits, right? One of them became arguably the most famous German poet there's ever been, deserving of that title. There's other German poets, please, we'll get into arguments, but and Schelling and Hegel, pretty significant, let's call them, German philosophers. So epistemic monism, let's talk about that very briefly. So the concern there is with, by the title, right, it's really, if you want to understand how do you unify, right, all these things together, you unify them through, if you want to have the unity of reason, then you need to have a unity in justification. So it's really about an epistemological problem here, epistemic monism. It's about knowledge. And to do that, Kant had told us, right, to organize knowledge under a fundamental principle, that principle had to be indubitable, they'd said. It has to be absolutely self-evidently certain. Okay? Apodictic is its technical name, right? It's self-evidently the case. So they would found everything on a fundamental axiom, taking the term from geometry. It's self-evidently given. Right? This is why the ethics in Spinoza has all those axioms. They're supposed to be graspable directly through intuitive intellect, right? The third kind of knowledge. You can just see these things and they're unarguable, right? You don't justify them because they justify themselves. They are literally, they scream out, this is the case, right? They're self-evidently true. And that's what they were constantly looking for. What is the axiom upon which we can build everything else? Reinhold's proposal was representation. Fichte's proposal was self-consciousness. I mean, they all tried to come up with candidates for this axiom and then derive everything else that's knowable from, and that would be knowable, right, from that fundamental axiom. Because it contained the foundation for literally everything else to be constructed upon. So there's epistemic monism. We could do much more with that, and they deserve to be treated and examined much more deeply. For our purposes, their concern was primarily knowledge and an axiomatic foundation. Hegel's incredibly indebted to them and incredibly aware of them and also critical of them. We'll talk about why when we get there. Practical monism. Here, they would say we need a monistic foundation, so do the epistemic monists, obviously. We need a monistic foundation, but the monistic foundation is not one of knowledge so much for them, it's one of integration of the wholeness of humanity. So they're going straight to the kind of cultural milieu. They're saying, look, we're torn apart as human beings between, say, reason and desire, the soul and body. And what we need to do is not so much worry about knowledge, that'll come, that's secondary. So this epistemic question that you saw in the epistemic monist, that'll be there, but that's secondary to the practical monist. The practical monists say, look, let's think about the integration of the human being. That we can think about all the elements of the human being as integratable with one another. Schiller, who's a great representative of this, and many of the early German romantics come from this Schillerian moment, right, where he wants to say, look, the way you need to think about human beings is not as divided between their reason and their desire. You need to think about those as integrated with one another. The term he used for that, of him. It's where Hegel got that term, which we'll worry over later. He doesn't use it in the same sense that Schiller does, but that's clearly where he got the term, because it means to integrate these seemingly opposed moments. Reason tells you one thing, desire says another. He launches that critique against Kant's practical philosophy in particular, right? The incentives are struggling, we're struggling with these incentives to do otherwise than the moral law tells us to do. And Schiller says, well, that does happen, but come on, it does also happen that you can know what the right thing to do is and also enjoy it. And that's the moment, as he called it, of grace. Grace, that's when both of those are together. That's the integrating moment, right? That's the practical monistic foundation that he and Herder and the early German Romantics, thinking particularly the Schlegel brothers and Novalis, really point as being the root of what they're doing. A lot of argument about whether that's the case for all the people I just listed, but it's enough, right, to make sense of it, I think. Then obviously the ontological monists. The ontological monists knew about all these other monisms. They're well versed in all of them. They've read, they've studied with them, they know this stuff. But their view was that they didn't get sufficiently deep enough. They didn't go to the root of the problem. That the epistemological axiom, not enough. That the integration of the human being, not enough. Important, right? All that stuff's great and wonderful, and they were on the right track, yes. But they didn't go deep enough because they didn't go to what makes all that stuff possible. What makes all that stuff possible? Glad you asked. Being makes all that stuff possible. Being, B-E-I-N-G, being, Zion in German. Being makes all that stuff possible. And what do we mean by being? Not the being of this table, not the being of that bottle, not the being of these books, but being as such, pure being. So Hölderlin famously is sitting there listening to Fichte. Fichte is telling him, look, there's a fundamental axiom called self-consciousness, and everything flows from self-consciousness because that's self-evident, that we're aware of ourselves. Not only are we aware of the world, but we're aware that we're aware of the world. Our self-consciousness, right? Every time that you're having an experience, you don't think, oh, there's an experience happening. You know, you say, that experience, that's my experience. The I think is attached to all my representations, said Kant. And Fichte is saying exactly right. That's the foundation, the synthetic unity of apperception in Kant. That's the foundation of everything. Not necessarily what Kant thought, but close enough. Okay, so this is the spirit and letter with Fichte and Kant's relationship. Right? Let's get the spirit, if not the letter, of Kant. So he says, self-consciousness is the foundation of everything. Hölderlin's sitting in those lectures and going, no, that doesn't work that way. What do you mean? It's self-evident that we have self-consciousness. Right. Hölderlin's going, right, I get that. We do have self-consciousness. I'm not denying that we have self-consciousness. But the only way the I think can attach itself to those representations is if the I that's experiencing and the I that's receiving those experiences can somehow or another be united together. And the only way that can happen is there's a subtending oneness that they both already are made possible by. He writes this out on the back of a little sheet of paper. This is being judgment possibility. And he says, the only way you can have that unity underlying that identity of self-consciousness is to have a unity of being that subtends self-consciousness. Now, I don't want to be overly dramatic. I'm about to be. I don't want to be overly dramatic about it, but you don't get Schelling or Hegel without that moment. You just don't. Nobody else, literally no one else, none of them had that thought before Hölderlin had that thought. They knew that from Hölderlin. They were his classmates. They were in conversations with him repeatedly during this period. Kant and Schelling at this point, Kant was a kind of, Hegel and Schelling at this point, Hegel was in essence a Kantian at this point. Right? He really loved the practical philosophy, right? This is where you get the writings about Jesus and writings about the positivity of Christianity. All that stuff is him roughly saying, Kant's right, but we need a cultural religion, a false religion, a people's religion, be able to, harness that idea and really ground it. He was a Kantian. He was a reforming Kantian philosophy. Schelling was basically Fichte's, go out and do nature philosophy boy. Right? He said, go out, you're a prodigy, I get it, you're really brilliant, Fichte's saying this. You're really smart, you're really brilliant, you should go out and figure out how we do what I'm talking about in the realm of consciousness, how that gets, makes possible the natural world. Neither one of them had this idea. Hölderlin, brilliant insight. being as such, as he says, pure being, that's where that language comes from. Subtends, my language, not his, undergirds, supports, or his language. It makes possible, he's using the Kantian language, right, of regressive conditions. What's the condition of the possibility of self-consciousness? Being is. Well, then being is more fundamental than the axiom. Being is more fundamental than the integration of human being. If that's the case, then that's where we gotta go. We gotta go to being. So we need the unity of being to be thought of. Now, Hölderlin philosophy is incredibly interesting. His poetry is even more so. They are related, right? We could do a whole class on just that. And if you're interested in that, please put that in. I'd love to do a class on that. We can talk about that sometime. But for here, let me boil it all down to basically two ideas. This is what we need for Hegel. It'll be enough. He argues for, in that brief little fragment really, which we even argue about which page goes first, because he wrote it on both sides of a sheet of paper, right? The argument is he didn't number the pages. So which side of the paper goes first, right? Is it the being side or the judgment side? Right? Want to figure out which one is which. But he does argue on the two sides of that one sheet of paper for this claim, these two claims. He argues for an ontological thesis, I just talked about it, right? That being, he calls it by other names we talked about last time, the element, the ether, both of which are terms that Hegel obviously picks up from him. The ether that subtends all, that being as such, pure being, he calls it also sometimes beauty, nature, all those are substitutable terms for him for the same thing. He also calls it famously the henkai pan, the all-in-one. And is the absolute unitary foundation, it's the limit ground of self-consciousness. It's what Kant would have called the transcendental unity of synthetic unity of apperception, what Fichte would have called the unity of the intellect, the ego, or self-consciousness. That all that is grounded in being as such and requires it. So being is the ground or limit ground of all that exists in any way that it exists, because he did believe what Fichte was telling us, which is that everything flows from self-consciousness. So if being makes self-consciousness possible, then being is what makes possible everything that exists, everything that is. So there's the ontological thesis, the primordiality of being, I'm gonna put it that way, pure being. What do we mean by being? It literally has no content at this point, right? Hölderlin is very adamant about this. It's just this ground of all things that is determined in various other ways. We'll come back to that. So there's the ontological thesis. He also had an epistemological thesis that he ran at this point, right? On those, in that fragment, those 2 pages. And that is, if he's right about the ontological thesis, if being is indeed the condition for the possibility of all thought and all sensible intuition, it's the condition of the possibility of everything, then it can only be known. We're going to know being. We're going to be able to comprehend it in any kind of way, to know it in any sense. Then it can only be grasped by a special power. It can't be known the way any other object is known because it makes possible everything else. So if we're going to know it, then we have to be able to grasp it through a special power. That special power is intellectual intuition. That is the direct, immediate experience of the whole. The direct, immediate experience of the whole. Now, Fichte had already picked up from Kant this notion of intellectual intuition. He uses it to talk about self-consciousness. So Hölderlin's well aware of that. He knows how Fichte's used this term. This is 1794. He's very well aware of how Fichte's already picked up this term and started using it this way. But Hölderlin is saying, I think that that's actually, it's not about self-consciousness, which, fine, but maybe it actually applies even deeper than that. It applies to how we grasp the whole, of which self-consciousness and consciousness and everything else that follows from that is made possible. He would also call that, and you can imagine here's where his poetry flows out of his own philosophical thought, that intellectual intuition is also, he calls it an aesthetic act. An aesthetic act. This is something you can only grasp aesthetically. It's what he's always trying to convey in all these early poems. Frankly, arguably, it's what he's trying to convey in all his poetry. He's trying to get you to grasp the whole that underlies the whole thing, and the way to get you to do that is poetically. It's the only way you can do that. He didn't think it's a discursive form of knowledge. It's a direct, you can't do it in concepts. You can only do it in images, through the evocation of experiences and feelings, and that's what poetry really speaks, the language of images, symbols, and feelings. And because it does that, then it can open up this oneness that we can all have experience of, the oneness of being. That's the epistemological thesis. Yeah, John.
I want to make sure I understand the word you're using. You're saying aesthetic and not aesthetic?
Aesthetic, right? So the experience, it's experience, aesthesis in Greek
Nice.
means experience, right? But it's not just, it's not always about the experience of beauty and the experience of art. He means both. He means you experience it literally, aesthesis, you experience it, and you experience it in the presence of art. Does that help?
Yeah, I easily associate that word with the latter that you use.
Yeah, that's, he's using it to cover both of those ways of thinking about it. Thanks for that. Now, with that context in place, that make a little bit of sense? Have I lost everybody completely? Or just a little bit of loss? Okay. So then we turn to, last time, the prefaces to the 1807 edition, the 1807 preface to the phenomenology, and we turn to the preface to the Science of Logic from 1812, so that 5-year span there. We talked about a little bit of that last time. And we began to explore last time what he calls there the logical science. What's that project? What's the problematic it's trying to address? Those kinds of questions in Hegel. I'm going to focus on, again, this time, though, the preface to the logic, right? So that's going to lead us into the introduction more directly, rather than getting in all the details of what's going on in the phenomenology. I will reference back, as he does in the introduction to the phenomenology. That's why I want you to have it in place, the preface. But let's go back and look about what he says in the preface. I'll be brief about this as well. So he talks there basically about three things. In the preface to the Science of Logic, 1812, the first preface, edition of the first. Preface is the first edition of the Science of Logic. He talks there about three things. First of all, he talks about what he calls the historical preconditions that make the project undertaking in the Science of Logic possible. So he talks about historical preconditions. He talks secondly about the repercussions of those conditions thus far, what they've done in particular to the sciences, the disciplines of both metaphysics and logic. And we'll come back and talk about why those two, and what they got to do with one another. On the face of them, absolutely nothing. So why is he talking about both of those? And then he says, and this is the kind of crazy thing he says on page 9 of the translation, is that the science of logic would be a true metaphysics. Okay, that's just nuts, right? We all know, they all knew back then, they weren't living in a completely different era that didn't think about logic in roughly the same way we think about logic. There's been advances in logic since, of course, we have propositional logic. They didn't. They used the term logic. We'll talk about all that stuff. But the basic idea is that logic, in whatever form it might be in, were the rules of thinking. That's it. If you want to have well-formed concepts, well-formed judgments, well-formed arguments, you go to logic to learn the rules of inference, the rules of judgment formation, the rules of concept formation. It's just the rules for how you think well. It doesn't have anything to do with metaphysics other than you would abide by the rules of logic if you're making metaphysical arguments. Because, you're making arguments, and whenever you're making arguments, you should follow the laws, the rules for thinking, and the rules for thinking and logic. But, they don't have anything intimately connecting them with one another. So when you're looking at that preface, and he says on page 9 that logic just is, metaphysics, you should go, sorry, what? This is a book of the science of logic, right? I'm going to open on page 1 of this book, whenever the hell we finally get there, and it's going to be about the rules of thought, and you're going to be sorely disappointed, because it's about 500 pages before you get to anything like a rule of thought. We won't get to the rules of thought as they were understood at that time, concept, judgment, and inference, called syllogisms, right? We won't get to those until the concept logic, right? Here we'll be dealing with stuff like being and essence and actuality. Well, wait a minute, that sounds like metaphysics. It certainly doesn't sound like logic. So why in the world, why ever would you equate them, which is what he's doing, identify them? What's logic got to do at all with metaphysics? Isn't it just the form of thinking? And isn't metaphysics claims about the in itself, which last time I checked, Kant said can no do. Can't know the things in themselves. You can think about them, you can, not the noumenal, you can believe certain things about them if you have warrant, but you can't know a damn thing about them. So how in the world does this make any sense? So let me just rehearse, take you back through those 3 points, and then we'll focus obviously on that last point about logic and metaphysics. So let's begin with the historical conditions. So he says, that line I focused on last time, the transformation of the past 25 odd years toss off line. But as we saw last time, it's referencing the transcendental term, the monistic term. We just looked at that period. We thought that's 25 years, 1787 to 1790 and following. And he talks about that the past 25 odd years as having a theoretical component, right? He's talking about the advent of the critical philosophy of Kant. He's writing in 1812. And then also the socio-political dimension of that, which is the French Revolution, 1789 through 1799. And he thinks that both of them are telling us the same thing. This was a fairly common view at this point, right? That the critical philosophy and the French Revolution both had at their core, in different ways, obviously. One's a theoretical pursuit and intellectual, the other is a practical, social, political pursuit. But at the core, they had the same agreement. What were they about? That humans ought to govern themselves. They were both about autonomy, the autonomy of reason. There's the core agreement of what both of them are really doing. And he says, well, what has that done so far? Right? This is Hegel. What's that done so far? What's been the repercussions of that? What's been the payoff of that? The revolution in the social political sphere, the revolution in thinking, the critical philosophy in the French Revolution. What has been the payoff of that? He says two things. One, about metaphysics, the other about logic. Remember that first paragraph in the preface, he says, we want to see what the repercussions of this are for logic. And you want to say, well, right, that's the title of the book, but what are those things got to do with logic? Logic, remember, is the rules of thinking. What's this got to do with, why do these things matter at all? Right? The rules of thinking. The rules of thinking are not bothered, are they, by what's going on in France and what happened up at Königsberg. These are irrelevant to these kinds of basic rules of thought, how you form concepts, how you put them together in judgments, how judgments are put together in inferences. This is as old as Aristotle. So what does this got to do with that? He says it's had two repercussions, right, so far. And he calls this, in the case of metaphysics, the esoterics, or the exoteric consequence of critical philosophy and also the French Revolution. What has it brought about? The downfall of metaphysics. Now, by calling it the exoteric, right, it's the public facing, what everybody can see, he's talking about what the Kantian philosophy has done to metaphysics. It's ruined it as a discipline, right? The way Kant was read is, can't do metaphysics anymore. Why? Because we read the first critique. You can't know the end itself. And as we know from Plato, up through Leibniz at least, Wolff past him, we know that to do metaphysics is to know things as they are in themselves. The rationalists claim to know things as they are in themselves, irrespective of our belief about them, irrespective of our conscious awareness, thought about them, the way things truly are. And he's saying, well, yeah, everybody who read Kant says the phenomenal numinal divide means you can think those things, but you can't know them. So you can't know what the nature of being itself is. You can't write the sophist, just to give an example out of Plato, right? You can't write the sophist because what is the sophist all about? It's about laying out intricately, this is the weaving, right? Laying out how things are structured together and how they're all put together in terms of these fundamental categories, same and other and so forth. He's saying, right, since Kant, we can't do that. We've been basically barred. Why? Because those are all, as he says, taking a line straight out of the first critique, those are all figments of the brain. Figments of the brain. They're not real. Now that does leave open the possibility that there's an esoteric teaching, a hidden doctrine, right? And if you look at Kant, as I mentioned last time, right, this is Hegel being fairly faithful to Kant at this point, saying, yeah, but that's not exactly what Kant was saying. He wasn't saying we couldn't do metaphysics anymore. He was just saying we couldn't do old-fashioned dogmatic metaphysics anymore. Everything in Kant, as I mentioned a moment ago, is preparatory to doing a critical metaphysics. That's why all of his later books after the three critiques are all called The Metaphysics of Natural Science, The Metaphysics of Morals, because he thought you could do a critical metaphysics, and he meant those titles. But not in the old-fashioned dogmatic rationalist way, right, sure, but in a critical perspective. Well, what's a critical metaphysics? There's the right question. That's what Hegel's reminding you of. That's the esoteric doctrine that's going on there. Okay, well, that's the downfall of metaphysics, but maybe a way of rethinking metaphysics. Okay, fine. What's the repercussions for logic? Well, thus far, it's been to say, oh, logic's just the rules of thought. So it's a pure formalism. logic, this is what makes it very, very useful and practical. This is why you can teach it as critical thinking, for example, to college students. It's because what? Well, it's formal. It's hollowed out. It doesn't have any content of its own. This is what makes it incredibly useful. It applies in each and every case because it doesn't have anything in its own case. It doesn't have its own unique domain. It's just a set of rules for when you're thinking about things, but it doesn't have any aboutness of its own. Now you can say, well, logic is the teaching of those rules, right? But there's nothing really substantive, contentful about those rules. The content always comes from elsewhere. This is why if you've ever taught critical thinking, you have to go looking for examples, right? Because the examples don't come from logic itself. They come from being applied all the time to case studies, right? You're looking for examples of, well, here's some reasoning, let's analyze that. Wonderful thing to do, right? But that means that you've rigidified this sense of logic can only be formalistic. And just like metaphysics has met its downfall at the hands of the critical philosophy in the French Revolution, so logic has met its emaciation, that's the term he uses for it. It's hollowing out, really, at the hands of those same two events. Now, there's Hegel giving you a kind of, that's the milieu in which I'm operating. So if you come to this book, this preface, if you come to this book expecting to get a science of logic and what the hell that is, then I'm going to tell you, let me set the stage for where we're operating. We're operating in a world in which metaphysics is off the table, and logic is nothing other, or it's at best, a tool for thinking. That's it. It's formalism, it's extirpated, we can't do it anymore, metaphysics is gone. It's no longer available to us. And then he says this, take a look on page 9 with me again in the preface. He says this. Look in the middle of page 9. He writes this. Now, whatever may have already happened to the substance and form of science in other respects. So that's a quick sort of, whatever happened to metaphysical science, whatever happened to logical science so far, its downfall in terms of metaphysics, its formalistic emaciation in the case of logic. Whatever might have already have happened to the substance and form of science in other respects. The science of logic, that literally is the logical science, right? The translator is a bit helpful, too much helpful there. Logical science, that makes up metaphysics proper, but that ought to stop you in your tracks at that point, right? Because it's obviously delusional. Metaphysics is about the nature of God, the soul, the world. That's what natural theology is, that's what rational psychology is, that's what rational cosmology is. That's the doctrines, that's the central components of metaphysics. So said Wolff. And Wolff is simply trying to systematize what he sees in Leibniz and what Leibniz saw on offer already in Plato and Aristotle. So how in the world is he saying, what he says there, the logical science that makes up metaphysics proper, or then he says, or, this is just the same thing. These are a bunch, whenever you get this in Hegel, this or thing, it's just like, or you can replace it with this. Pure speculative philosophy, which is him, has to date been much neglected. Why? Well, because we've experienced these repercussions, right? He's just laid out. The downfall of metaphysics, no longer on the table. Logic emaciated to pure formalism. Now, if you don't know anything else, and let's assume for the moment we haven't read any further, this is all we know of Hegel and this is it, then you might get the sense that something's up with this logic metaphysics thing. That he was talking about metaphysics when he did it here, and was talking about logic here to come to this very point where he seems to just say, hey, they're the same thing. And frankly, you'd be right. That's all he's doing, right? He does not argue. This is a preface, remember. Extra systematic. He does not have an argument or justification for this claim here. It's just asserted without warrant. That logic, just is, as he calls it here, makes up metaphysics proper. It's what metaphysics truly and really is. Now, if you're completely naive, you ought to be shocked by that. If you've read Kant a little bit, you might say, well, I remember something about that. There was something about, transcendental logic in the first critique, and how that makes it possible to have a critical metaphysics. That could be there for you, right? And if you hear that, then you're hearing the esoteric underlying the exoteric, right? That's what he's referencing here, alluding to. But that's all he gives you, because look at what he says next. What I more precisely understand by this science, the pure speculative science, the logical science, and its standpoint, I have provisorily stated in the introduction. So now he's just said, I'm going to give you that in the introduction. By the way, the introduction is also, you ready for today, an extra systematic text. We'll talk about why when we get there. So this is like, I'm going to assert things here, let me assert that stuff over there too, because he's not going to argue for it there. The fact that it was necessary to make a completely fresh start with this science, he's already warning you, if you're expecting your rules of thought to be on page 1 here, not about to happen. A completely fresh start. Oh, well, we're going to start off with concepts then, right? Nope. We're going to start off with being. Well, the concept of being, actually, not so much. We're going to start off with being. Completely fresh start with this science. The nature itself of its subject matter and the lack of any previous work that could have been used for the undertaking reform of it, so why I had to start all over, may be taken into account by the fair-minded critic if even a labor of many years was unable to give this effort a greater perfection. He's telling you, I worked on this really hard. Give me some credit to, I tried, but I was working without a map. I didn't have a predecessor. No one went before me. I wasn't just reading Kant and going, oh yeah, we could just do this and tweak this a little bit and it doesn't work that way. Then he says this, he unloads finally this claim on you. The essential point to be kept in mind, I take this to be an admonition, part of reading Hegel is learning how to read Hegel. Right? As I said last time, when he tells you something like this, it's worth pricking up your ears and saying, okay, he's serious. The essential point to be kept in mind at all times is that an altogether new concept of scientific procedure is at work here. A new method, that's what scientific procedure means, a new method. So one of the questions we're going to have coming out of the preface is, okay, what the hell is this method? How does this work? Aha, maybe this is that thing we hear sometimes about, the dialectical method. We'll see what he says about it. As I remarked elsewhere, he's now pointing you back to the preface of the phenomenology, which you read last time. Inasmuch as philosophy is to be science, it cannot borrow its methods of scientific procedure. It can't be borrowed from a subordinate science, such as mathematics. Why would anybody think to do that? I don't know. There's an ethics that's written in accordance with geometry. Last time I checked, it's by Spinoza. That looks like a borrowing of a subordinate science's methodology. It cannot borrow its method from subordinate science such as mathematics, any more than, so here's another one it can't do, it can remain satisfied with categorical assurances of inner intuition. Well, these are starting to sound familiar a little bit, right? You can't go back and do Spinozistic metaphysics. You also can't just rely on inner intuition, intellectual intuition. Or can make use of argumentation based on external reflection. We'll come back and talk about what external reflection is. So he's just discounted, right, disabled 3 ways of thinking that you might normally think would be the avenues, the methods of philosophical thought. Mathematics or some other subordinate science you could adapt the methodology from them. It could be sociology for that matter, any other kind of subordinate science than philosophy. It can't be inner intuition, it can't be external reflection. Well, we want to ask ourselves, well, I know you're referencing back to the preface of the phenomenology that it can't be that. Trust me, it does say that in the phenomenology, preface of the phenomenology, but you can still have the same question, oh, why not? Why can't we do that? I mean, Spinoza did pretty well at it, didn't he? For example. Hölderlin is doing pretty well at it. Fichte seemed to be doing pretty well. I mean, there's a lot of examples of people doing this. Why can't we do that? So why? He's just asserting, we don't have the why answer. He then says, on the contrary, so instead of doing that stuff, last 2 lines on page 9, on the contrary, it can only be the nature of the content. So here he's hinting at what he's going to be doing, what a pure philosophical, speculative philosophy, proper metaphysics would do. It can only be the nature of the content. Whoa, 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 whoa. Logic has no content. Remember? It's formal. It's the rules for thinking. You have to think about things. Right? So there's no content to logic. What is the nature of the content? Then it can only be the nature of the content which is responsible for movement in scientific knowledge. Where's this content coming from? You're telling me somehow or another I'm just supposed to know that there's, the in itself? How am I supposed to know that? You just took away one of the ways in which I know that stuff. Inner intuition, intellectual intuition, the immediate grasping of things. I don't have that available to me. Where am I going? For it is the content's own reflection. Oh, come on, please. Contents don't reflect. Humans reflect. That's what we do. Think about your day so far. Welcome to reflection. That's what we do. We think back upon ourselves. We reflect upon our day. Contents don't reflect. Humans reflect. The content of what? We don't even know. And it's now supposed to be doing this thing that's an operation that sounds like a mental operation that we do. This is all literally, you ought to be reading this going, this is clearly preposterous. That's what his readers would have thought. Even if they gave him, even if they were like Kantians, right? They would go with it and say, well, there's a form of metaphysics that we know is possible, like critical metaphysics, and it has something to do with, not logic in this formalistic, emaciated sense, but transcendental logic, whatever the hell that is. And once we've got that going, then you could do critical metaphysics. But this content of its own? Every good Kantian knows that content comes not from the act of thinking itself, but from where? Sensible intuition. The manifold comes through sensible intuition, and then I can lay conditions upon it because it's required to make something out of the blooming, buzzing confusion that is the manifold into something that's actually an object of possible knowledge. But the content doesn't reflect, I do the reflection. Then he says, for it is the content's own reflection that first posits and generates what that content is. The only thing I'm trying to impress on you right now is this. This is ludicrous. And you don't need to back off from that. It sounds that way because it is that way. He's issuing a huge promissory note. Right? It's massive, and I don't want to deflect from how massive it is, because it is huge and massive. You can, reconstruct this in a much more gentle and agreeable and pragmatic way, but it's not what he's saying. I'd rather just stay with the audacity of the claim. The claim is we can't do metaphysics this other way, we can't do logic, and they are the same thing. What the hell does that mean? And we can't do it any other way than where the content of metaphysics and logic, whatever that is, generates its own content. How? It reflects. How's that work? Yeah. That, I think, generates at least 3 questions for us to consider taking it in. He says, I've talked about this in the introduction, then we'll take these 3 questions up and then take them up into the introduction. Here are the 3 questions. Right? First one, why in order for philosophy to attain science, to be science? And by science, remember, he's using that term Wissenschaft in the way that Kant uses the term, which is to say, it is genuinely justified knowledge of the truth. That's what we're talking about. Justified true belief is the way we would say it. It's JTB, right? Justified true beliefs, justified true knowledge. So why in order for philosophy to attain to be science, justified knowledge, so not natural science, not social science, but philosophical science. Why can't we use the methods and procedures, why can't the method and procedure of that science, the philosophical science, why can't it be drawn from other subordinate sciences? Why can't it be drawn from other subordinate sciences? Why can't it be drawn from inner intuition? Or why can't it be drawn from external reflection? Why are those sources debarred, right, from being our resources that we can go to think through this methodology? That's the first question, that claim that he's made there. Why is that the case? Then he makes this claim about what he calls the altogether new concept of scientific procedure. So, reasonable to ask, what is that altogether new concept of scientific procedure? What is the proper methodology of the science of logic? You could even say, I think this would be right to say, of Hegel's thought in general. There's the second question. What is then this new method? Then finally, thirdly, what does it mean to say, and this is what we were just talking about, what does it mean to say that it is the nature of the content of a science, in this case, logical science, the content of logical science, which, what is that? That itself moves in genuinely scientific forms of knowledge, and how are we to understand that it is this content's own reflection, as he says, that generates the content's determinations? Now, in the introduction, Hegel lays out 3 concepts that address each one of those 3 questions. You might not be surprised to hear. I don't know if you picked them up along the way, but I'm going to emphasize them in the introduction. Here's the 3, and then we'll take a little detour, then we'll come back to these 3 questions. Again, look at these 3 concepts. So the first concept is the concept of immanence. Immanence. More about what these things mean in just a few minutes, but there's one concept that we're going to work on. The second one is necessary progression. where that necessary progression happens through negation. So eminence, necessary progression through negation. And then lastly, retrogressive grounding. Retrogressive grounding, which is almost a contradiction in terms. I think those three concepts, not each one, they don't match up that way, but we'll talk about them. Those three concepts are the core of Hegel's response to the questions that are left hanging in the preface. Left hanging in the preface. So we'll come back to those. But I want to pause for just a moment here. So that's a setup for the introduction. We'll be back to those questions. They'll guide us through the introduction. But I want to do two things here that we've, go back to those two questions about critique and about the hermeneutic paradigms, to put those in place before we turn directly to the introduction. So everybody make some sense of where we are. And I'll go back to those three questions, so if you forget them, I'll remind you of them. All right, so I want to develop that claim about what the fundamental critiques of Hegel's thought are, through which we approach the reading of his text, since we're about to now launch into that. And I want to also look at, situate the claims we've been considering about the problematic of Hegel's thought in the project within the broader traditions of Hegelian interpretation, or interpretations of Hegel's thought. So what is the critique of Hegel's thought, and what are the fundamental paradigms for thinking through or approaching Hegel's thought? So we've got a little bit of this stuff already in place, so we can already begin to think about the critique of it. And I think the best way you understand something in philosophy is always a critical understanding of it. That means you've got to work on the understanding of it first, which is, in Hegel, quite a big challenge. But you've got to do that critically. So that's why I want to introduce these criticisms of Hegel's thought here rather than wait till the end, so to speak. I want them to always be shadowing us through this process, bearing them in mind while as we try to understand what Hegel's doing. So there's many critiques of Hegel's thought. Right? We could spend the rest of the 20 weeks talking about the criticisms of Hegel's thought. Instead of that, I want to focus on what I think is the most fundamental of those critiques, and the one where most of the others flow out of in some form, fashion, or another. And so the name for that central accusation against Hegel's thought is panlogicism. Hegel's thought is a form of panlogicism. And that's the claim, to quote one of his most severe critics, that's the claim that everything only exists through, that is by virtue of the logical. Everything is what it is by virtue of the logical. Now that severe critic was Schelling. Right? That's who wrote that. He says that in his lectures in Berlin in 1841, and his audience are all of the early German, early Hegelians, or young Hegelians are out in that audience listening to what he has to say about these things, and that's where this really gets disseminated, right, is that idea of the panlogicism. Look, the problem with Hegel's philosophy is he's a panlogicist. But let's see what that means, because that also gives birth to two very specific criticisms of Hegel's thought that we still inherit to this day, and we work with them, so I'll talk about those out of those. So in essence, panlogicism contends that what Hegel fails to think, what he ultimately fails to think, is being. Well, we already know so far he's an ontological monist, so he, like Hegel, it's all about being, right? I mean, that's wrong. Right? It's got to be wrong. Right? That charge has got to be off base. So you can call it being. They would also say he fails to think existence. So Schelling is sometimes called the first existentialist because he says this. And that claim about being or existence goes by a variety of other names. You can call it also materiality. That's what Marx and Adorno are going to call it. Alterity, that's what Levinas will call it. Or difference, that's what Deleuze and Derrida, for example, would call it. Why? How is this possible? Because being is front and center for Hegel, right? Like it was for Hölderlin, like it was for Schelling. Why isn't he thinking it? Because they would claim that being or existence exceeds or eludes the grasp of reason. It exceeds the grasp of reason. Remember, Hölderlin said, you can't know it, you can only intuit it. And Schelling remains throughout his career committed to that thesis. This is what the positive philosophy, negative philosophy of the later Schelling is all about, right? It's about this issue. So being is outside of the grasp of reason. You can only get it through intellectual intuition. Well, Hegel says you can actually think it. and know it completely and exhaustively. He's a panlogicist. He thinks you can actually know, have logos of, right? Have an account of the nature of being itself, when their claim is that being exceeds the grasp of accounting, that you can't give an account ultimately that's satisfactory, that's sufficient of it. Now, you then can't know being as such, you can only touch or intuit it to gain access to it. That's the Herderlinian, Schellingian. Here's the divide. Here's where Hegel comes into his own, right? He is not a Herderlinian, he's not a Schellingian. He really is dividing himself from them. He wants to say, up until 1807, Hegel would have, you could have asked Hegel, hey, look, is being fundamental? Yep, how do you know it? Intellectual intuition. He says this in print, right? So we know that he did think that. He thought that just like Schelling thought that, just like Herderlin thought that. They were all in fundamental agreement with this. But in 1807, in the Preface to the Phenomenology, amongst other places, he distances himself from that very claim. Why? Because he thinks that Kant was right, that every account we give has to submit to critique. Intellectual intuition is a dogmatism. It says, I can know something and I can grasp it directly and I can't give you an account of it because, you either have it or you don't. As I said last time, Schelling famously says, you can't philosophize without intellectual intuition. And you either have intellectual or intuition or you don't. You can't be educated into it, you can't be argued into it. It would be intuition if you could. So Hegel's claim in 1807 is, no, Kant was right. We have to demonstrate all the claims of consciousness. So if we're going to claim that we know something in itself, that we have, as he called it in the phenomenology, Hegel now, as we call it in the phenomenology, absolute knowing, knowledge of things as they are in truth, in themselves, then we've got to demonstrate the warrant for that claim. We can't just appeal to a capacity, special capacity we have of intellectual intuition. But here's where that criticism comes back against him. Schelling is saying, yeah, we can't actually know everything. There's something that exceeds the grasp of reason itself. To claim otherwise, to claim that everything is what it is and exists only by virtue of what is logical, that's panlogicism. Now that criticism, panlogicism, has then two variations that I want to think about for just a moment with you. And these will set the critiques that we're going to work with throughout the rest of the class. Then we'll come back to the way Schelling himself actually formulates this in his lecture course. So one would say, right, about being exceeds the grasp of reason. Right? Anyone who thinks otherwise is guilty as charged of panlogicism. One kind of critique says this, look, there's necessarily something that exceeds the confines of speculative totality. There's something that exceeds the confines of speculative totality. Let's call that the ineffable. The ineffable, something that is out there that we can grasp through perhaps intuition, intellectual intuition, not sensible intuition, but we can't know. So let's call that the critique from the ineffable. It's about, can philosophical concepts actually know what they purport to know? The other critique says, okay, we get that one, but let's worry also about whether we're not making that which is knowable amenable to thought by how we conceive of it. This is the critique from the immemorial. So if you want names to attach to these, I'll unpack them here in just a second, but if you want names to attach to these, and these are strange names, at least the first two, and maybe the second two are strange as well to put together, but I do think they go together around these kinds of critiques. The critique from the ineffable is what you get in Adorno, it's also what you get in Levinas. So there's two reference points for this kind of criticism of Hegelian totality, Hegelian systematic philosophy. The immemorial, I took that term out of Derrida, obviously, but it applies in a different way, but it's, I think, reasonable to talk about it this way, for Deleuze as well. Right? So Derrida and Deleuze put them together around the immemorial. So let me just unpack the critique from the ineffable, the critique from the immemorial, then we'll be back in Schelling. All right, so consider first the critique from the ineffable. Its central contention, the central contention of the critique from the ineffable, is that any project like Hegel's will necessarily fail because of the means such an enterprise must employ. What's the means it must employ? Concepts. Concepts. That's how you build a system. You build it as a set of concepts. It's how reason claims it knows things, not through the particularities, but through the concepts of things of which the particulars are instantiation. But concepts, the ineffable critique reminds us, are nothing more than ideal and thus abstract determinations of the very reality that they seek to comprehend. So if that's right, they're abstractions, then it necessarily follows, doesn't it, that a speculative totality, like Hegel's trying to build, which is comprised of a systematic arrangement of concepts, would be structurally incapable, because it has to use these tools, these means, concepts, of fully comprehending reality, since by definition the breadth and depth of being exceeds the confines of ideality. It exceeds the confines of abstraction. The limit to systematicity at work here is thus the derivative standing of concepts with respect to reality. There's more reality than there is in the concept. Or as Adorno puts this at the beginning of Negative Dialectics, objects do not go into their concepts without leaving a remainder. That's why it's a negative dialectics. There's always something outside of what's being conceptualized. There's a remainder left over, something outside. Adorno calls that materiality. He has other names for it, I'm picking on one, materiality. In Levinas, he would say, yeah, that's alterity. That's what can't be conceptualized. That precedes everything else. Ethics precedes ontology, right? That's claimed in Levinas. So being is ineffable. It irrevocably remains outside or beyond the purview of the very concepts to which it gives rise. And so the critique from the ineffable is really about the ontological status of concepts, their authoritativeness. Are they merely the formal determinations of the processes of thought, the so-called, we've already got this in our domain of thinking already. Are they merely just rules for thinking, the objects we use of thought? Or are they the abstract but empirical patterns recognized in the natural world? Are they natural kinds? Or are they the very foundations of all that is, as Hegel's about to claim? He talks in the introduction about this strange thing called objective thinking. What could that possibly be? My thinking's not objective. It's subjective. It's in me. It's in you. How in the world does that term, that phrase, make any sense? Objective thinking. So the issue goes, I would suggest, to the very core of Hegel's project. To grasp the whole from which all else derives and upon which all else stands requires the construction of a complex of concepts. That's the building of a system. And these concepts must be shown to be capable of capturing the fundamental nature of reality. Hence, for the project of totalization to be possible, it must be shown that no impassable gulf exists between ideality and reality, thought and being. At their most fundamental level, for Hegel's project to have any hope of being possible, thought and being must be one. Otherwise, thought, the domain of concepts, is abstracted from being, and being exceeds. There's more in the reality and the materiality and the alterity, whatever we're going to call it, than can go into the concept itself. Make a little bit of sense, that kind of critique? Very important criticism of Hegel. Goes to the very core of what he's doing. It's not incidental. It's not like, hey, Hegel could just, forget that, that's crazy talk. No, it goes to the very core of what he's trying to do. Strikes at the central concern there. What is it? What are concepts? Just what are concepts? If Hegel's project is going to be feasible in any kind of philosophical sense, then we're going to have to figure out what he means and does with concepts. It can't be what we have traditionally meant and done with concepts, because they traditionally are abstract generalizations. What is that going to mean? What are these concepts going to mean that we're going to use in science of logic? The ineffable, the critique from the ineffable. Let's turn now to the critique from the immemorial. Ineffable will make a little bit of sense? Give me just a few minutes here, finish this out, then we'll take a break. So let's talk about the critique from the immemorial. It poses a quite different, related, but quite different problem that again challenges, I think, the basic core trajectory of Hegel's thought. Its concern, like the critique from the ineffable, is with the way in which thought relates to reality. That's what the ineffable is about. Reality is more than is thinkable, that's their claim. But here it's not the means that this relation employs that is an issue. This isn't really about concepts here for the immemorial. But the manner in which that which is other than thought, being, what we're trying to think about, how that thought is rendered amenable to being thought. How do we make reality thinkable? So the critique takes its bearing from the claim that what totalization seeks to do is nothing less than integrate all that lies beyond thought within its own domain. It tries to think everything that presents itself to it. It tries to exhaustively grasp the nature of reality, not leaving anything behind. That's a pretty amazing claim, right? Maybe far-fetched, ambitious, too much, maybe. But it's what the claim is about totalization seems to be all about. That's what Hegel seems to be all about. So the criticism says, well, okay, well, if that's your ambition, then to do that requires taking the reservoir of multiplicity that defines the fundamental structure of reality. If you look at reality, fundamentally, it's about multiplicity. It's about the blooming, this is Kant, the blooming, buzzing confusion of the manifold. That's what comes in. That's what we get. That's reality. If you want to talk about reality, you can talk about this thing, distinct from that thing, distinct from that thing, but at the end of the day, it's all a blooming, buzzing confusion that we try to organize. We try to put some structures on. But if you just let them go, right, this is what you've got, a kind of chaotic soup. So there's an infinite variety out there. But what does systematic totalization do? Well, the claim from the immemorial is that it has to reduce reality down to a contradiction. That all of this multiplicity, all this variety out here has to be reduced down to a kind of what's called speculative simple duality, contradiction. Something is what it is by virtue of its not being what everything else is. Something is what it is because it's not everything else. There's the fundamental speculative duality. That this thing is what it is, this book what it is, this phone is what it is, the bottle on my desk, you, the table, whatever. Everything is what it is because it's not everything else. That's where its determination comes from. So there's the fundamental speculative duality, says the critique from the immemorial. And that speculative duality really then is a contradiction. It's this thing has its sameness over against the otherness of everything else. What is everything else? Well, the famous phrase that gets used here for this is, oh, it's what remains. Rest. This is where Derrida gets this term. It's in Hippolyte. Hippolyte uses this to talk about the speculative duality. So the specificity of a thing, its integral identity, lies in its being differentiated from that which it is not, its other. That which it is not, its other. In this relation, then, the multiplicity of being is brought into a form recognizable by thought. Thought can think duality. Thought can think contradiction. It knows how to reconcile the oppositions of that. And that thereby, reality, because it's contradictory at its core, it thereby becomes comprehensible, amenable to thought, comprehensible, graspable by thinking. It becomes an alterity that can belong to thought, that can be thought's own. Simple put, the recipe for systematic totalization, render the entire messiness, variety, multiplicity of reality into a speculative contradiction, and then you can think it. Then it can be totalized, then it can be systematized. But that's a reduction. That's to take, this is the term you see in Derrida, the differential matrix of the world and render it into a contradiction. And that allows it then to be thought. And then by being thought, you say, well, here's how it's reconcilable. So you're dependent on this messiness of the infinite variety, the multiplicity that is the world, the blooming, buzzing confusion. You reduce it down to a duality to be thought. So you're dependent on that, but then you exclude it. You say, that's not the nature of reality. The nature of reality is contradiction. It looks like an infinite variety, but it really is this simple duality. So being is at once excluded and included. Being is at once excluded and included. It's excluded as this multiplicity. It's included as that which makes possible everything that's thought from it. It's the immemorial, right? That which cannot not be thought. Right? It's always shadowing. It's the shadow. This is what Merleau-Ponty calls it, right? The shadow that's always lurking behind us. So it questions not so much the authoritativeness of concepts. It's not saying the same thing that Levinas and Adorno are saying, although you can read them in various ways, but it's not saying the same thing there. It's saying, no, this really has to do with the question of determinacy itself. How do things get determination? How do they get their specificity? Do they get it as a result of contradiction? If they do, then that's on the way to totalization. It's on the way to a kind of reconciliation in identity. If they don't, if they get it through some other kind of determination, that they're differentiated, and that differentiation, like difference, or difference in itself, as Deleuze calls it, If that's what does the determination, then that may not be amenable to thought itself because it doesn't abide by the law of contradiction. So if differentiation is integral to something being what it is, namely to being determinate, then what is the nature of difference whereby something becomes what it is, gains its identity, its specificity? This is the fundamental question that's on the table. Again, this goes to the very heart of Hegel's philosophical project, I think, for at its core, Hegel's thought holds that what the whole, W-H-O-L-E again, within which things are what they are, is forged by a process of negation and integration. So it is about differentiation. They're close at that point. What he calls the movement of the concept, the necessity of the concept. A movement that takes negation as contradiction, we might say, to be the fundamental kind of determining relation. Well, if that's right, then Hegel's guilty as charged. That's reductive. That's reducing the multiplicity down to a duality, to a contradiction, to allow it to be thinkable, and therefore to be systematically totalized. At least that's what the critique asserts about what's going on in Hegel. We'll see whether we think that or whether he thinks there's something ineffable. We'll come to those. Now those two critiques then, there's the ineffable and the immoral. Those two critiques then, they pose fundamental questions. And those questions were actually raised as long ago as Schelling's final lectures in Munich and in Berlin. These he gave beginning in 1827. He's given these lectures, he gave them all the way through 1854. In 1841, right, he was called into Berlin, right, to take over after Hegel's death to get rid of the Hegelian spirit, literally was his charge. That's why they brought him in from Munich. And remember, this is already a problem, right? These were classmates. Right? Schelling bursts out on the scene, well-known, really popular, really important. Hegel slowly rises. He gets the chair in Berlin. Schelling didn't get it. Right? After Fichte has the chair in Berlin, Fichte dies. Huge parade in Berlin to go to the burial site. Then they give the chair to Hegel. Schelling's going, excuse me? Did you not see what I've done? It's amazing stuff, right? It is incredible stuff. He doesn't get it. They bring him in, okay, we get it now. We got rid of Hegel, right? He's dead now. Let's exercise, literally let's exercise the Hegelian spirit. So we bring him in, he gives these lectures, particularly in 1841. In 1841, here's some of the people that were in the audience hearing lectures on Hegel's logic. That's what he was lecturing on. Kierkegaard was there, Friedrich Engels was there, Bakunin was there, Ronke was there, Burckhardt was in the audience, Alexander von Humboldt was in the audience. And this is a roster of the intellectuals that went on to define much of German philosophy and thought from there on out. And what are they hearing? Well, they're hearing this. They're hearing that Hegel is a panlogicist. That's the charge against him. So think about this for just a moment. When you think about the early Marx, you think about Engels is at these lectures as well. When you think about those young Hegelians, all of them, Feuerbach, all of them, where do they first approach Hegel? What defines them in their critical relationship to Hegel? They all will say some form or fashion or another as, he's a panlogicist. So that logic stuff's crazy, nuts. Why? Because he thinks that you can embody the nature of reality within a system, and you just can't. Why? Because materiality, says Feuerbach, or praxis, says Marx and Engels, and you can go through the whole list. It exceeds the capacity of reason to actually comprehend it. So Schelling says, here's the real problem in Hegel. He's a panlogicist, and he says, that has two faces, two sides to the panlogicist charge. He calls it Hegel's double deception. Hegel's double deception, right? So he's literally got the opening of the science of logic, which we're about to look at, right, before him. And he says, this book commits two deceptions, the double deception. What is it? He says, well, let me put them in the form of questions, not so much accusations. Let me put them in the form of questions. He says, are the categories of the logic, the ones we're about to read, are they merely subjective thoughts masquerading, here's the deception, masquerading as objective concepts? This book seems to be a book of metaphysics, right? We've already heard that claim on the table. Metaphysics is the nature of reality itself. And what Schelling is suggesting is that maybe that entire book, with all those wonderful categories it has in it, all those wonderful concepts that are in it, maybe those are really just subjective thoughts that Hegel had about the nature of reality. But they're presented to us, they're masquerading deceptively as objective concepts, as Hegel's own term for it, objective thinking, objective thoughts. I think that question is the question of the ineffable. Maybe being can't go into the concept. Maybe there's something left over whenever you try to put reality into a concept. So he's questioning, are the concepts up to the challenge of systematism? And then he says this, here's the other, the double deception, here's the other side of the deception. Is the development of the categories truly imminent? He's read his Hegel, right? He knows that Hegel, in the introduction and elsewhere, says that this is the nature of the content itself is to develop from within itself. That's immanence, right? It develops from within itself. That we don't put something into it. It does it itself. It is, as we've already seen in the preface, the content's own reflection. Not our reflection upon it, but its own doing, as we're about to find out. The methodology of Hegel's philosophy is observe. Watch. See. See what? See concepts transform into other things. I'm going to do that? No. Well, somebody wrote this. Yep. Well, what are they doing? They're recording how concepts necessarily entail their own otherness. They negate themselves and become something other, or transform into something other. Just to stay with the major headings, being necessarily entails essence, essence necessarily entails concept. How in the world, right? Doesn't make any sense at all. But that is the claim on the table. At least already in the preface, he said, the nature of the content is that it reflects upon itself and thereby generates its own determinations. So Schelling says, don't be so quick in buying that crap, right? Philosophical crap. You have to ask this question, is the development of the categories truly imminent to them, or, which is what Hegel wants to claim, which is of course ludicrous, Schelling thinks, or is it determined by an extrinsic goal, aim, purpose, of total and complete totalization? In other words, it's rigged from the start. If what you're trying to achieve is a systematic whole, what you're trying to do is construct systematically coherent totality, then of course from the inception of that project, you're going to, aren't you, this is Schelling's question, assume, or at least put in place, rig it, so that you can always think the nature of reality and subsume it into your system. That's an early version of the question of the immemorial. I mean, you were already rigged multiplicity into a duality, that's how you rigged it. And now you can think it, of course it's thinkable once it's in a duality, once it's a contradiction, of course you can think it at that point. That's not the issue, but you've already reduced it. Now, those two questions from Schelling, the double deception of panlogicism, the question of are these merely subjective thoughts or are they objective concepts? The first deception, and is this movement really imminent or is it something extrinsic that's driving the whole thing? Those are the two questions that are the central critiques, both the question of the immemorial and the question of the ineffable, that we'll come back to at the end of the course. Right? I will definitely take us back there, but I'd like them to be in place as we go through this project. We look through this material all the way through. We need to be asking this question about the ineffable and the memorial all the way through. Now, we can't address it all the way through. We won't have the resources to completely address it, but we will be at the, not next week, but the week after, we will be at the discussion of being. And you want to ask yourself, being is nothing, nothing is being, and that's becoming? Is that imminent? Or is that already rigged to get where we're wanting to go? Is there, to use the line that Derrida uses for this, a teleological constriction of the negative? Or, take up the first question, are these just, thoughts about reality that don't actually comprehend reality itself? That there's something that still exceeds reality. There's something that doesn't go into the concept, to use Adorno's language for this. So that the dialectics is always inherently negative. Those are critiques we'll come back to. All right, let's take a break, then we'll look at the hermeneutic paradigms and then into the introduction. So give me about a 10-minute break, so 4:48 we'll be back and we'll move on from there. Thanks.